Like most good superhero stories, Spider-Man comes with a host of friends and allies who complete and flesh out the world of our hero, and among these characters few have had the staying power of Mary Jane Watson. Pretty much every major adaptation of Spider-Man we've seen throughout the 21st century, from video games to live-action blockbusters to animated flicks, has tried to include the character in some form. The problem I have with pretty much all of these adaptations, to a greater or lesser extent, is that I think these adaptations are using the specter of calling a character MJ as some sort of generic signifier that this is the real or canonical love interest for Peter Parker, but they aren't that concerned with really adapting Mary Jane herself in terms of her actual personality or interests. But what is the personality of Mary Jane? Well, to be honest, the first thing that you need to know about Mary Jane is that when she's first introduced, she's kind of a bad person. Mary Jane believes in doing one thing, and that's having a good time, which she says explicitly more than once, and we know she means it since it also pops up in her various thought bubbles. She's carefree, not very interested in being tied down to any particular suitor for very long, and has aspirations of being a movie star. Mary Jane is not interested in her friends' real-world problems or their personal tragedies, but ultimately that's a good thing because it gives Mary Jane a lot of room to grow throughout the original Spider-Man comics. With lots of comic characters, they're pretty static and 60 years will go by without them really growing much, but because Mary Jane starts off the way she does, it gives the writers the opportunity to make her more sympathetic over time, as she is pulled more directly into Peter Parker's life. We gradually get to find out the reasons Mary Jane adopted her carefree personality, and eventually MJ learns to be a more sympathetic friend and genuine help to those around her. Now, I am by no means saying that people who adapt Spider-Man stories have to include Mary Jane. 2012's Amazing Spider-Man chose to adopt Gwen Stacy instead, and I thought they did a really good job with that character. But if you do choose to adopt a specific fictional character, it makes sense to actually bring some of what people loved about that character to the forefront, and not just use their name or physical appearance. I hate to pick on the 2019 Insomniac Spider-Man video game, because it really is very good, but it's probably the worst offender of what I'm talking about. The PlayStation Spider-Man title is generally very good at adapting the feeling and look of the Spider-Man world, and in particular at nailing the character of Peter Parker. But when it came to Mary Jane, I was left a little confused. This version of Mary Jane is, at her core, kind of just a red-headed ripoff of Lois Lane. This MJ is not a celebrity or a celebrity wannabe like her comic counterpart. She doesn't have MJ's iconic carefree personality, and instead, this MJ is a high-minded, idealistic journalist. What annoys me most about this character is that there's already a classic Spider-Man love interest who works at the Daily Bugle and has been presented as a journalist in the past, that character being Betty Brant. Betty Brant is one of the 3 most important women Peter dated before MJ, the other 2 being Gwen Stacy and Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat. These are the women that Peter Parker described himself as being in love with before settling down with Mary Jane. So if you're going to have a Peter Parker love interest based on a comic character, these are some good options. Literally just erasing Mary Jane's name from the game's script and replacing it with Betty Brant would have done wonders towards making the character more Spider-Man-ish. It's possible the Insomniac developers were trying to adopt the more recent Brian Michael Bendis alternate universe version of Mary Jane, which would have made a little sense since she does eventually do some journalism. The thing about this though is that Brian Michael Bendis is doing the exact same thing I've been complaining about, which is taking a character's name and visual look, although sometimes just the name, and then just importing a bunch of unrelated character traits for an almost entirely new character. If you don't like a character, or if you don't think that they have anything interesting or fun to bring to your story, then don't adapt them. Use a character you like more to fill the same role. If you have a character who's famously confident and outgoing, and you make them a wallflower, it's just confusing, particularly in the case of the Spider-Man video games, since much of the world was very clearly designed by people who really like, or at the very least aware of, Spider-Man history, so it feels like an even more baffling decision in light of that fact. Now, to be fair, the Sam Raimi films do get a lot closer to the classic version of Mary Jane. She is an actress, and there are hints of her tragic backstory which are implied rather than shown. The difference here is that she doesn't seem to be very good at her job, and she's still really timid about her ambitions and lacks the characteristic MJ confidence, even if, in the comics, that confidence is often a mask of her true intentions. In the original storylines, Peter and Mary Jane have a similar conversation about their future to the one shown in the Sam Raimi film, except that Peter is saying, "Oh, you plan to be an actress?" And MJ replies, "Correction. I am an actress. It's just a matter of time till the world discovers that fabulous fact." And again, maybe you find that personality off-putting. Maybe you just wouldn't like a person who talked or acted in that way. Peter's associate Ned Leeds pointed out that he thought MJ kinda sucked, and he hoped that she and Peter wouldn't start dating. Peter himself didn't always get along with Mary Jane, and after the death of his previous girlfriend, and their mutual friend, Peter says, "Don't make me laugh, Mary Jane. You wouldn't be sorry if your own mother died. I wouldn't want to spoil your fun." And again, MJ is often willing to describe herself in that way, though perhaps with a bit less candor, saying, All my life I had been happy-go-lucky Mary Jane Watson, no strings, no obligations, no responsibilities. In other words, when she starts out, she's the antithesis of Peter Parker. But if we're talking comic books, opposites definitely attract, and over time, as their relationship matures, Peter's friends and family do a complete 180 and start actively rooting for them to get together. And Mary Jane starts to become a real friend and confidant to Peter, even revealing that she has already discovered his secret identity. And this is the version of Mary Jane that I want to see in a future Spider-Man installment. A version of MJ that actually has something to do with the character whose name these adaptations are borrowing, and a character who has an actual arc. Or again, if you don't like Mary Jane as a character, which is fine, then just pick from the billions of other Spider-Man love interests. For all of Peter Parker's complaints about the supposed Parker luck, he gets a shockingly large number of dates with a variety of women who seem to be madly in love with him since they tolerate his constantly running out on them to go be Spider-Man. Seriously, you have so many options. In essence, if you're going to adapt a character, actually adapt that character.